I was trying to look at Yingtai's book with a perspective, from a memory perspective. So I'm not a specialist on Taiwan, not at all, but as I said, I'm interested in memory studies, and I think reading Yingtai's book, makes some sense to look at it from a memory perspective. So my topic for today, I called it Drama of Displacement, Cosmopolitan Memory in Yingtai's Big River, Big Sea. In October 2009, China was guest of honor at the Frankfurt International Book Fair, which ran under the slogan Innovation and Tradition. I think that most of you at that time not even had started your studies, but it was quite an event because Mo Yan was involved, and Mo Yan would 3 years later receive the Nobel Prize for Literature. And it was quite an infamous, so to say, event to a certain extent, and I think it had quite also some lasting effect on Sino-German relations. 2009 was also the year when Idiazi, referring to a circle of 60 years in Chinese cosmology, has been completed. It was the year when the Communist Party self-confidently threw a self-advertising party, marking the 60th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. Official festivities excelled in spreading euphoria and national glory. Gigantic military parades showed off China's alleged power at home and on world stage. I think all over the years, PRC history had never left the slightest doubt that 1949 is nothing less than the beginning of a heroic national saga, when the Chinese Communist Party, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, defeated Chiang Kai-shek's national troops, which were then forced to retreat to Taiwan. Even worse, mass campaign and wartime atrocities, social disruptions and political terror Chinese people had been exposed to since then were clearly regulated to distant memories and to the realm of oblivion. It didn't exist. In this connection, the Frankfurt Special Exhibition Hall, which traditionally is set up for the guest of honor at the world's largest book fair, was just one stage to take. And also this stage became a showpiece of unaffected national power and unique Chinese cultural heritage. It went more or less neatly hand in hand with the Western appetite for a certain Orientalist exoticism that was satisfied by an eye-catching and pretentious display of China's multi-ethnic and traditional cultural artifacts. During the so-called special program, however, a sort of public space set up for interaction between writers and the interested public, not Chinese culture, but Chinese cultures were featured, and critical interventions took place. For the Taiwan-born writer and cultural celebrity, former director of the Cultural Affairs Office in Taipei, First Minister of Culture of Taiwan, and Professor of Literature, you know all this, Yingtai, this became the stage when she launched her book, Big River, Big Sea, in an almost 2-hour performance. While the moderator basically was let to stew in his own juice, Yingtai interacted with the audience, mainly obvious with a Chinese background, at her own terms. Hello.
Hello.
Welcome. Great to see you. Her book launch was entertaining. She was offering a mixture of video clips, documented the making and the evolution of the book. She was delivering readings and gave lively reports and added once and again her personal view and family stories. However, the show was not only entertaining, it was also convincing. Many in the audience were moved to tears. People were holding each other's hands, pockets and bags were searched for tissues. The hustle and bustle of the book fair frenzy seemed non-existent for a moment. There's someone else there. You have been there at the book fair 2001?
At that event, the other event, yes.
So Yingtai, shortly described as a public intellectual. Since long Yingtai has made herself, I think, a name as one of the most outspoken and seemingly fearless public intellectuals in the Chinese-speaking community, always trying to balance her changing identities as political official on the one hand and critical intellectual on the other, constantly constructing and deconstructing Taiwan's identity, fearlessly putting any politician and public authority in place, always being at ease when engaging a broad audience, you will find out tomorrow, always generating official interest and acting with success on international stage. Her first collection, Wildfire, was a fierce political critique of the government at the time when Taiwan was still under martial law. It cemented her reputation as enfant terrible. Death threats ensued. A cosmopolitan herself, Yingtai has for the most part of her life actively engaged with her respective intellectual and cultural communities. While living in Germany, she published in the most well-known German newspapers, I'm not naming any, and she frequently has been approached for interviews, panel discussions and lectures on political and cultural issues, like, for example, cross-Taiwan relations, Taiwanese, Chinese identity issues, etc., ever since. Between her two stints into officialdom, from 1999 until 2014 she was cultural minister, and before 2004, she was the director of the Cultural Affairs Office in Taipei, and 2012 until 2014 she was cultural minister. So between these two stints into officialdom, she joins the City University at the Hong Kong and the University of Hong Kong as a visiting scholar, and there she notoriously shaped and stirred up Chinese political and cultural discourse, fiercely criticizing any government, the government in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, and the PRC. Most famous her open letter to Hu Jintao. Her declared mission to contribute to reconciliation within the Sinophone world and to foster mutual understanding on a global scale is best reflected in her Cultural Foundation, a non-profit organization established in 2005 aiming at, I quote, cultivating a civil society, developing partnerships among Chinese-speaking communities, and fostering intellectual dialogues in a global context, end of quote. So this is from the website of her, of this Cultural Foundation. Since you basically already know, I think, everything about Yingtai, and you certainly have thought a lot about the book you have been translating and you have been reading, I will only give a short, so to say, or some thoughts when I read the book. So in my short paper today, I claim that Yingtai in her book, for which I actually still have not found the correct label. Is it a novel? Is it what is it actually? But maybe we can discuss this later. I think she created in this book a meaningful framework to access the Great Divide, 49, as individual and collective trauma of displacement. What interests us today is the question whether her book does have the potential to replace national discourses of heroic memory by cosmopolitan memory that is characterized by an unheroic, self-critical discourse. Whose memory is she actually creating? And in how far is her book a reflective act of reconciliation? So the following ideas I'm having are, so to say, three parts. It's like the past, the present and the future. And we start with the past. In Big River, Big Sea, Yingtai explicitly sets out to tell the story of the Quaker White from a double gender perspective. On the one hand, that of a daughter, ignorant of her parents' traumatic past, searching for her real self, Chadawa. On the other hand, that of a mother, trying to explain to her son Philip what actually is not explainable. Content-wise, the narrator takes the perspective of, quote, a descendant of a loser, making her narrative voice even more fragile and sympathetic, trustworthy and allegedly authentic. By framing the text as an extended dialogue with her German-educated son Philip, whose homework for history class actually sparks the narrator's own family history project, she not only establishes a knowledge hierarchy between the narrator and the book's characters, as well as her readers, she even situates her reasoning about the Chinese trauma of dislocation conveniently in post-World War II German historical culture or discourse. Her own mother's suffering of dementia as the story's point of departure is literally a strong metaphor for the gradual vanishing of the generation of victims and the individual witness. Here the author clearly drives the point that to rescue individual history from oblivion is not only the responsibility of a dutiful daughter, but a social, a political, and a historical necessity. In order to hinder the embodied experience of trauma to vanish into the past, communicative memory with its limited time horizon has to be transferred into cultural memory, which is maintained through cultural formation of texts, rites, and monuments. I think you're probably all aware that this is the idea of Asma and others who have done a lot of research on memory studies. So her book is nothing less than such an extent, to try to transfer communicative memory into cultural memory. Again and again, the author repeats her mission to rescue life experiences from oblivion, of those whose voices never have been heard, whose stories never have been told. When asked about the motives of writing this book, she says, I quote, too much injustice. For 6 decades, there was never a sorry spoken to these people. I do not care which battlefield you belong to. I do not care which country you represent. I do not care to whom you pledged your alliance or whom you have betrayed. I do not care whether you are a winner or a loser. I do not care how you interpret justice or injustice. Can I say this to you? All those who have been trampled, insulted, and hurt by this era are my brothers and sisters. End of quote. In the book, the narrator lays bare her endeavor to tell a forgotten and suppressed history from a highly subjective take. Quote, all I know, remember, discover, and feel is deeply personal, just as this retelling is completely personal. And she goes on to explain that it is impossible anyway to show the full picture, and even if there was, language and words cannot faithfully express it. End quote. The author does not claim the role of a historian. On the contrary, the possibility to present a true and complete picture of history is put into question. She consciously chooses her individual perspective and intentionally prepares the reader for, I quote, a biased and selective impression of history. End of quote. And at least from a historian's perspective, she develops exactly such a biased and selective history. Yingtai, as you know, she has been traveling for more than a year, talking to witnesses, conducting interviews, collecting archive material, searching county and province records, listening to personal memories, reading diaries, letters and memoirs. And last but not least, she's also trying, of course, to get a grip on her own life story. She presents a kaleidoscope of human drama, struggles of individuals and collectives during this period shortly before and after the retreat of Chiang Kai-shek's government. In her text, life dangles on a string, and it is not more than a glimpse of time, of being at the wrong place at the wrong time, of following a wrong intuition that turns one's fate into an absurd nightmare. You remember the heartbreaking account of how her mother left her infant son back with his grandmother, simply for the fact that the little boy screamed bloody murder when being dragged into a full-packed train. And this is, of course, an especially touching scene, right? Yingtai meets her brother for the first time only 40 years later. So the narrator pushes the reader's empathy by again and again staging the theater of war as an absurd drama to highlight the overall message. No matter which side you are on, victory will not necessarily improve your life. War knows nothing but losers. The comic tragic interview with the two aged soldiers that got trapped in the mainland for 50 years due to their involuntary communist identity comes to mind, do you remember? When they decided to leave their wives and children to return to their home country, to their home city in Taiwan, they came to a strange land, which no longer was home. Trauma of displacement, as she makes clear, is not reserved for Waishanren, but could actually happen to anyone, anytime, anywhere. And most of those involved had not the slightest clue why, what for, and on which side they were fighting. And in the end, it didn't even matter. The Great Divide is not a Chinese solo performance, not a war with Chinese characteristics. Conflicts and episodes from World War II in Asia Pacific and Europe are also described in this book, and they are also part of the same pattern. The theater of war is a global drama. The life of the individual turns into a nightmare in face of state-sanctioned violence. The downtrodden, poor people are toys in the brutal course of the violent 20th century history. So how does the emplotment of the story, now I say story, history of the book, of the text, strengthen the overall message? On the surface, polyphony or polyphony is the poetological structural principle of the text, form and content-wise. The book is a montage of family histories, interviews, archive discoveries, formal and informal talks, travelogues, personal reflections, etc. Conceptually, the text is obliged to many narrators and many perspectives, however, coherently arranged and held together by the narrative voice in order to create a coherent picture. and to support the larger idea. The idea of polyphony is also realized in terms of content. We read a mosaic-like collage of individual tragedies, lives and fates, struggles for survival. In order to strengthen the moral agenda of her writing, she organizes her material by way of what Yoli has called synchronicity. This literary mode has the effect that the reader perceives of causally unrelated events that coincide in time as having the same meaning. That means they are not linked through case and effect, but through meaning. These meaning-filled coincidences the reader views as having some directions and not just randomness and chaos. In Great River, Great Sea, the fate of different characters is often told by linking them in space and or in time, which actually intensifies the general message of the book. So this way of interweaving to create meaning has at least two implications. The first one, I would say, is that Yingtai empowers her characters by creating these meaningful coincidences as their lives are storied and put into an overall meaningful narrative. From a post-traumatic perspective, creating a meaningful story is a necessary step in the trauma process. Reconstructing a shattered world and finding a meaning in representation for the trauma helps to work through the trauma. The second implication of this interweaving, however, is that she is empowering the agenda of the listener narrator, who is permanently creating empathy and taking sides with the victims by way of connecting their fate by meaning. So the impossibility of coming home, the feeling of displacement, of not belonging, as one of the main topics of the book, is storied. We may take the story of the two aged soldiers from Taiwan who come to a strange place on their return to Taiwan, what I just mentioned, after 50 years of longing for home, as, for example, synchronized with the return of Mei Jun coming back to Chunan, her mother, which had been erased and demolished, and its townspeople relocated for the sake of the nation's prosperity. Actually, these two events are not related, but they get related in a way, the way how she is structuring, how she is storying her text. So the listener narrator is passionately creating an agenda for those forgotten by history and collective memory. Getting back to the first point, I think we can all agree that Big River, Big Sea is a powerful narrative that rescues the trauma of displacement from oblivion by providing engaging accounts of ordinary people caught up in brutal warfare and political turmoil in the end, in the late 1940s. It definitely can count as a powerful counter-narrative of national heroic memory. What we read is, in large parts, a consciously outlined antithesis of the heroic national narratives surrounding the PRC's genesis as well as the official Kuomintang history. It's a sort of passionate outcry that attempts to turn down the facade of state-sponsored historiographies on both sides of the Taiwan Strait. There's another perspective in this, how she is plotting, or how the author is plotting the text. The second perspective, however, is also derived from trauma theory or trauma research, and that concerns the role of the listener. When you read the book, it's the narrative is very often the listener, most of the time the listener. So, and here I talk about the listener of the narrative of extreme human pain. And this listener, of course, faces a unique situation. Psychoanalyst Dory Laub, in his discussion of the relationship between trauma testimonies and the listener, describes the role of the listener as follows, I quote, "The listener, therefore, is a party to the creation of knowledge de novo." So he's a complice of the creation of knowledge de novo, a new one that doesn't exist before. The testimony to the trauma thus includes its hearer, listener, who is, so to speak, the blank screen on which the event comes to be inscribed for the first time. End quote. I think this blank screen of the hearer needs a bit closer consideration. As we could see, the different and multiple voices, the polyphonic structure of the book, formally produces a multi-layered sort of literary composition. However, all these polyphonic voices, all these different narratives, perspectives, I would say, converge into one single voice that paints a coherent picture of exile and displacement, of the impossibility of homecoming, the devastation of war, whether in Stalingrad, in Nanjing, or in Changchun. So contrary to the author's announcement to resurrect individual lives, she actually deprives these voices of their individuality by merging their testimonies in the authorial voice, the voice of the author, of the narrative. Displacement has become the permanent condition. War only knows losers, even though they may become famous writers, statesmen, or Nobel Prize laureates. So one could argue that the author appropriates personal story to confirm her preconceived conclusions, thereby stripping individuals of their subjectivity and integrating them into, and now I'm very terrible, into the Yingtai master narrative. So from a historical perspective, I think this is no less problematic. Despite the perfectly legitimate humanitarian concern, her leveling of historical discrepancies is questionable. It not only negates differences in individual as well as collective traumatic experiences, it suggests comparability of historical events and facts. Therefore, it rather hinders the formation of cultural memory of historical trauma. To assume that the positive identity formation on the basis of an abstract general evil is possible and adaptable, I think, is at least disputable. So the text argumentation, I would argue, does in terms of its structure not differ too much from a state-sponsored memory politics. The past is being used to serve the present. History is a selective business that works on abstract and general terms without fissures and contradictions. Now we're moving to the present. In Xenophone context, Lu Yingtai's book clearly is a powerful and controversial contribution to history, identity and memory discourse in contemporary China and Taiwan. Interweaving historical facts, oral history testimonies, and meta-historical narratives, she contests clearly the official historiography. Kuomintang winner rhetoric gets a real slap in the face. Chiang Kai-shek and his 1.2 million who followed him in 1949 to establish a dictatorial regime are nothing less than a low-spirited and devastated mass of desperados. What they brought along was their shame of having been outnumbered by Mao Zedong's Red Army, of having left behind their families, of having abandoned their motherland, lost their identities, and to a certain extent even their language. So what followed was the brutal collision with Taiwanese people who had suffered no less as subjects and soldiers of the Japanese troops and from a devastating defeat in the Pacific War. But manipulated narratives of communist revolutionary history are just as well object of Yingtai's fierce critique. For example, when she reconstructs the siege of Changchun and the starving out of its inhabitants by the communist troops. 300,000 people have died, as many as in the Nanjing Massacre, when Japanese troops brutally attacked the city in 1937. So this is the number that burns itself into one's mind when you enter the monumental Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall, the city center of Nanjing. A museum that has been rebuilt in 2007 to be ready for a big celebration, I guess. And it has been rebuilt and enlarged, and it has been reopened in 2007. And I have just been there a couple of weeks ago with a group of students. We did an excursion there. And everyone was really impressed, and it's quite impressive. So if you have the chance, go there and have a look. It differs from much of the museums you might have seen in mainland China, I think. So against the current background of the CCP's resurrection of the humiliation narrative as to spur on Chinese nationalism, this of course lays bare the manipulative nature of party historiography. While China's People's Congress recently approved of making the Nanjing Massacre a national anniversary, the deadly siege of Changchun is neither taught in school nor commemorated, not even known to its inhabitants today. So it's critique on both sides. And this is how she's, so to say, presenting herself in the present. So no wonder, of course, the book is banned in the PRC, but it was instantly turned into a bestseller in Taiwan and in Hong Kong. In Taiwan, it might be the most popular book focusing on Chinese civil war and the Great Exodus since the late 1980s and early 1990s. But it is, of course, far from being the only one. The discourse entering on the Great Migration between 1948 and 1956 began to develop in the late 1980s and in the early 1990s. Not at least due to the gradual disappearance of communicative memory. Memoirs, autobiographical texts, novels, interview collections, films, and even TV series on the military family's village, the Jianchun, appeared. Qi Bangyuan, with her Qiliuhe, A River of Big Torrents, and Zhang Dianwan, Pacific 1949, Stories of the Journey of Taiwan, Taiping Lun, 1949, and so on, are among the more well-known of this type of book. If you check the internet, you will find digital memory spaces. For example, the Digital Archive for Memories and Narratives of Taiwan, Waishengan. There's also an association of mainlander Chinese, which was founded in 2004. So these 流离叙事, these exile and separation narratives, or these refugee stories, are put forward by civil war migrants, but even more by their descendants, so the next generation, the second generation. And the narrator in the text clearly sees herself as one of them. I quote, "I only understood many years later where the feeling of being different from the others came from exile and separation." This is what Yingtai writes in Big River, Big Sea. So what these stories and narratives have in common is their construction of a Waishengren identity that is not only a far cry from the Kuomintang official history, but it also distances itself from the newly emerged Taiwan-centered history. It portrays the duality of Waishengren as colonizers and power holders on the one hand, and as war refugees and disfranchised victims on the other hand, creating a Waishengren identity on the basis of the Great Divide as a traumatic refugee experience is not only important in building a positive image, but also in order to get rid of the negative Waisheng image, which stands for a monolithic, homogeneous, privileged ruling class of people from the province outside of Taiwan, so Waisheng. And this negative image is, of course, clearly associated with an authoritarian nationalist regime. So this delicate status of individual and collective belonging has been described by Yingtai, as you know, in a different context as cultural schizophrenia. Apart from this, the book takes also a very clear critical political stance, despising political aims at the costs of human suffering. Its position itself into the larger context of memory politics that in her view clearly should aim at building a collective identity on the basis of acknowledging shame and guilt about past atrocities. And not, as she implies, as a heroic national narrative. So much to the present. Now, it's not much left for the future, but just a little bit. So, as we could see so far, in her text, Yingtai is digging out a forgotten past and is negotiating her findings in the context of the present. So how about the future? And in how far does her work bear actually a promise for the future? Yingtai's book is an important contribution to the building of what might be called the culture of dealing with history in the Singapore. In a book with the title Opening Historical Reconciliation in East Asia Through Historical Dialogue, which is also a book to which Yingtai actually contributed with an article, Bodo von Boris, he writes about the German perspective of history education and the role history education plays in the process of historical reconciliation. And I quote from what Bodo von Boris writes in his book. History is a scientific discipline, although often open to ideologies, interests, and drives. But even more, history is a social practice. Historical concepts are formed in the everyday conversations of citizens, allusions in mass media, ceremonies of priests and politicians, and the pictures and works in school textbooks. In Germany, we call these processes historical culture, or better, culture of dealing with history. And we know that they are by far more important and influential than the contributions of professors at universities. This is decisive for the idea of reconciliation too. End of quote. So the idea that history is a social practice. As we could see above, Big River, Big Sea can be read as a conscious act of reflective reconciliation insofar as it attempts to create a historical culture. It explicitly does not claim to be a piece of history, but it can certainly claim to contribute to the culture of dealing with history, which clearly is an important precondition for reconciliation. However, I think we can take this a bit further In their research on memory of the Holocaust, social scientists Daniel Levy, Nathan Snyder, and Ulrich Beck trace the development of cosmopolitan memory. Instead of national modes of memory, they argue for cosmopolitan memories, which, however, do not actually replace national memories, but rather are appropriating them. In cosmopolitan memory, it is that no longer the atrocities themselves which are at the center of attention, but, I quote, how the heirs of victims, perpetrators, and bystanders are coping with these stories and the evolving memories. What remains is the memory of a shared past. This sharing is not due to the desire of belonging to some community or faith in the national sense. Rather, it is the conscious and reflexive choice to incorporate the suffering of the other and the history of the other. End of quote. So, cosmopolitan memory thus implies some recognition of the history and the memories of the other. I think it goes without discussion, without saying, that Yingtai has a cosmopolitan agenda. Clearly, her book is the opposite of insisting on a national take. On the contrary, continuously she is uncovering how nations and state machineries function as ideological tools to mobilize people purely on a political agenda. So rather, her narrating of the Great Divide can be read as a way of appropriating cosmopolitan memory in the local, on the one hand, and localizing, making local, the cosmopolitan on the other hand. Big River, Big Sea, which narrates the Chinese suffering, is written in the spirit of a cosmopolitan memory, which in the year 2000 was institutionalized in the so-called Declaration of the Stockholm International Forum on the Holocaust. And I have to quote this again, because it shows the spirit, so to say, of cosmopolitan memory. I quote, "The conference declares its commitment to plant the seeds of a better future amidst the soil of a bitter past. We empathize with the victims' suffering and draw inspiration from their struggle. Our commitment must be to remember the victims who perished, respect the survivors still with us, and reaffirm humanity's common aspiration for mutual understanding and justice." End of quote. So in the best of the worlds, we can hope that transnational memories, to a certain extent, acknowledge a common past, might have the potential to provide a common framework in a world where many people are subjected to displacement and violence. Just to sum up, I think we can concede that Yingtai in her book speaks, so to say, with three voices, which however converge into one authorial voice. So the first one, the voice of the caring mother and dutiful daughter, rescuing the trauma of displacement from oblivion. This is made plausible by replacing the heroic state-sponsored narrative by the unheroic fragmentary stories. The second one is, and now we're in the present, the upright Chinese literati with a moral mission, formulating severe criticism on the state-engineered historiography and shaping collective identity. And the third one, Vision for the Past, the cosmopolitan public intellectual with a global vision, working towards reconciliation in the future. I think we can discuss the weight Yingtai is attaching or giving to each of these three voices, and they're of course they're intermingling. It's not just one and then the next one. However, I would like to conclude that Yingtai's text has a great potential to not only carry the burden of the past, but also to capture the present, and last but not least, to bear a promise for the future.